Hello, this is Deborah Clay, author of The Borrowed Boy and Just Be, and presenter of Castaway Books. Each week I invite an author to tell me about the books that have inspired their life and influenced their writing. This week's guest is Beth Miller. Hello, I'm delighted to meet Beth Miller here on my Castaway Island. Beth is the author of 5 novels and 2 non-fiction books. She writes women's fiction, which I love interviewing people on the island who write women's fiction because that's my love as well. And the books you've chosen, I'm really looking forward to hearing more and discussing them because they got me hungry to read them. And you pick up so many good book choices and ideas through this programme. I certainly do. So I congratulate you on Starstruck, which came out on the 12th of August with Virago, which is exciting.
Thank you very much.
You've had a great career with that being your 5th novel. You're a creative writing tutor and you are also a book coach. Excellent.
Yes, that's right. I coach books. Makes it sound like a football coach. I work with writers on their books to try and get them to the place that they want them to be.
Excellent. All writers need that. Shall we go straight in with your first book?
Let's go. So my first one is it's a children's book by Elizabeth Beresford called Awkward Magic. And Elizabeth Beresford was much better known for the Womble series, which are also really good. But Awkward Magic is one of my seminal books. I realised when I was compiling this list for you, Deborah, that all 5 of the books really had an impact on my own writing, and I think that makes sense to me because I feel very defined by being a writer. It's very much a big part of who I am, and so it makes sense that these books all related to that. So Awkward Magic I probably read when I was, 12 or so, maybe a bit younger, and I've read it again recently to my children, and it really stands up. I think it's still a really amazing, exciting book, and it's about a little boy called Joe, and he lives in Brighton. I think it's sort of 1960s Brighton, and that's kind of quite exciting to me because I live near Brighton now, and so some of the places that are mentioned in it are still there and you can still visit, although they're in different states to the way that Elizabeth Beresford described them. Some of them are much more smart now and some of them are much more run down. But Joe is, as is traditional in children's fiction, there aren't really any parental figures around. His dad's, I think, away being a soldier. I can't remember that bit. And his mum's died and he's looked after by a nice lady called Mrs. Chatter. They're really good names in the book.
Yeah.
And it's the start with summer holidays, and then he meets a most strange creature who he thinks is a dog initially, but it turns out not to be a dog, and they kind of have adventures to do with treasure, looking for treasure. And even just talking about the book now, I still get a shiver of excitement. It's such a good book, and she's got such a dry wit. The Womble stories, the original Womble stories, are actually very funny, and this is very funny. With some great characters, but there's a bit, the last few chapters, a bit near the end, it's just, I think that's what made me want to be a writer, because just the excitement that she builds up this tension and this excitement, and kind of fear, really. It's quite terrifying, some of it. And I've read it so many times trying to work out how she did it. How did she create this tension? I can't quite work it out. It is quite, magical, really. But just, I think it was the first time that I read a book and I realised, and I've thought this so many times since about books, but it just, how incredible it is that, just a flat book like this can make you feel so many different emotions.
Do you think, in your role as a book coach and writing tutor, children's books, they do have lessons for writers in? And I say that because for what you said, excellent ending, what you can learn from that, and also having a smaller book, it's almost like having it magnified so that you can really look at what it is that, the basic skeleton that makes that happen. But I remember I was in a book club, a reading group, and one of the ladies said, I love the famous five, which happens. So many of my guests on this island all cite famous five early on. And she said, and as an adult, I'm always looking for a book that gives me that same feeling of excitement that I had as a child reading famous five. So do you talk to writers about what they can learn from that with children's books?
Oh, I don't think I do really, and it's such a good idea. It is a really good idea because you're right. It's kind of, because they tend to be shorter. It is kind of how to do it in miniature. How to not have, especially how not to have too much slack to keep the pace moving, and to tie up all the loose threads that you've woven throughout. Children can't really tolerate, and why should they? Those loose threads left hanging. And I think that's a really, really important lesson for writers, whatever they're writing, to, make sure that, you haven't got a series of red herrings left littered about.
Yeah.
And they're also really, the famous five. Yeah, I did enjoy the famous five. They're really great on pace, of course. She was absolute master of pace, really, that, you just keep turning the pages because you really want to know what happens. So, yeah, that's a good idea. Thank you. I will nick that idea.
Well, the principles are the same, aren't they? Good writing. And not everybody's read all the same books if you're working with a group, but you can all quickly read and analyse a children's book. But before we ask you a bit more about what you were doing at that stage, just one more thing on the book. When I looked at the cover, because I look up the books before I meet my guests, I loved the cover. It had that nostalgic feel, and it reminded me of a book I loved at school, which was The Family at One End Street. I'm always looking for somebody who's read or seen that book. Does it ring any bells with you?
Read it, live in the same town that she lived in. Yes, I know it well. Yes, she, I can't remember, what's her name? Eve Garnett, something like that. I might not have got her name right, but yes, she apparently lived in Lewes, where I live. And apparently One End Street was based on a street in Lewes. So very excitingly. But yeah, no, that was such a good book. So I think you would like Awkward Magic. I think they're sort of, there's certain similarities.
Yeah, lovely. I just remember the school teachers reading it. I think it must have been they didn't have curriculums in those days, but it must have been recommended reading but not many other people have known that. But it still takes me back if I read it to remember as a child. Oh. You were about 12, I think you said, when you were reading that. What was going on in your life at that time?
Well, this was probably the first time that a big incident had happened in my life. I'd had a rather ordinary childhood, mum and dad and brother, and not very eventful. We lived in Ilford, which I think are you quite near there? I have a vague feeling. Girl. Well, hey, Essex girls unite.
I went to school in Romford and I grew up in Upminster. I was born in Hampstead, I add, so that I'm not Essex through and through, but from a very young age. And I live in the northeast coast of Essex now.
Oh, lovely. Well, yes. Well, Essex will always have a place in my heart, although I don't live there now. But I grew up there, and then I was around. I had a good friend who was a year older than me, and her mum was a family friend. And then I sort of only learnt this in kind of bits and pieces, fragments. This is very important incident if you're going to be a writer, to have this kind of childhood incident. But in fragments, it became clear that my dad and her mum were in some kind of relationship, and it became a bit of a family crisis. And no one really ever spelled it out. It was all very sort of hinted at, and just little bits and pieces came to my knowledge. My brother was 2 years younger, so he didn't really understand. He understood even less than I did, I think. But it all came to a head around, I was just on the cusp of 12 and 13. And I think it looked at one point like he could have left and gone to be with this other woman. And obviously everything kicked off with me and my friend. And it's a real seminal, sort of primal experience, really, that's cropped up again and again in my writing. What happened was a bit of an anticlimax, the sort that you can have in real life, but you can't really have in fiction, which was that he decided not to pursue this other relationship, or at least that's what we thought. and they moved away, and our family sort of got back to some semblance of normality, though I don't really know what went on for my parents after that. But I didn't see my friend again. And at the time, I think 12 is such an interesting age, because on the one hand, you can understand some quite grown-up things. Like, I understood that there was a problem, but I also couldn't understand my friend and I couldn't still be friends. And I wrote about this in my first novel, which took a long years to write, because I think I was working through everything as well as learning how to write a novel. But it was the first time that because all my novels really are sparked by what if, what if this strange thing happens? And that one was sparked by what if he had left after all when I was 13, what would things have been like? And as it turned out, he did leave eventually. He left when I was in my early 20s, again for the same woman. And I don't know, we'll never know now, because everyone pretty much who was involved in this has died now. But I don't know how much he was involved with this woman over the years that he stayed with my family. So that's always been an interesting source of speculation to me. But yeah, so that was kind of what was going on. And we were a Jewish family, and it was all caught up with my bat mitzvah, rite of passage for 13-year-olds. And so the bit where I remember it coalescing is being really upset that my best friend, who, though she wasn't Jewish, she was obviously going to have a big important role at my bat mitzvah party. I couldn't understand why she couldn't come. I think I felt like this beef was with the grown-ups. Why were we getting pulled into it? But my bat mitzvah was also a really sort of big deal. I studied for it for a year, and it was unusual then for girls to have a whole big deal like boys had for their bar mitzvahs. And my dad was quite a feminist, which, this is good, because he was obviously, there were things going on that he shouldn't have been doing, but he was also a good person. It's another reminder that characters are very nuanced. They're not all good or bad, they're a mixture. And so he was quite big in our synagogue. He was one of the founders of our synagogue, and he insisted that I had this kind of, same as the boys thing. And it was a really great day. I managed to get over my friend not being there, and acquitted myself fine, and then had this massive party, the like of which I've never had since, I think. So that's what was going on. It sounds like a lot, but at the time there were long periods of being really bored.
Welcome periods of being bored with all that drama going on.
Yeah, maybe, yeah.
But tell me, what happened with the friend? Did you ever have contact with her in adult life later on?
Yes. In fact, the contact with her in later life was the real inspiration for me starting to write that first book about what if, because when my dad did leave in my 20s, and he married this woman, and so our families were a bit more merged, but I was already an adult by then, so they weren't going to be very merged. But I went to a party that they had for, I think, my dad's 60th, and my ex-best friend was there, and nothing happened. If this was a drama, something would have happened, but in real life, we just, we had some small talk, and I didn't say, you betrayed me all those years ago. Although that would have been probably quite exciting. But I wrote about it. I wrote about, the kind of the power dynamic shifted, because when I was 12 and she was a little older, she was always sort of in charge. And then when we met as adults, somehow the power dynamic had shifted. I felt much more confident in myself, I guess. And so, yeah, we never had it out. I mean, we'll never have it out. It's fine. She was just a child as well. And I think that's what I was exploring in that novel, was that she was probably put in a very difficult position, that she kind of knew some of what was going on, and probably quite a lot more than I did. But so I don't really know what was going on for her. So I tried to think about it when I wrote my novel. I tried to put myself into her shoes about what that would have been like at the time.
That was good. Very cathartic thing to do. And she, being older than you, so she was a little older than you, and also being her mother, and sometimes mothers and daughters talk in a way that daughters and fathers don't. She perhaps did have more information, was more knowing than you were.
Oh, I think so, definitely.
So remind us what your first book was, because that sounds like an interesting book to read. The novel that you've been.
Oh yes, it's called When We Were Sisters. Yeah, and I'm still very fond of it. It was, it took a really long time to get anywhere with it, but I've really put, I'm very autobiographical in some ways, as first novels are. Though I did go off into, I wrote it so many times, I rewrote it so many times that it is very fictionalized now.
Excellent. Okay, shall we go on to your second book?
Yes. So The Go-Between, which is quite a good link, really, because I feel like my friend sort of was an inadvertent go-between, as is the lead character in The Go-Betweens. This is an old book by L.P. Hartley. I think it was written in the 50s or 60s, but set earlier. Most of it is set earlier, about a boy, Leo, and is it set in the 1920s or even earlier? I'm not sure. Maybe shortly after the First World War. And he goes to a friend's house. He goes to a sort of slightly smart school, and his friends are all smarter and more well off than him. And he is invited by his smart friend to go to his house in the summer, and it turns out to be sort of, quite a manor house. And he gets caught up in kind of adult stuff going on. And I realise, as I'm saying this, does sound a bit like my life then, that I was just describing, that, children getting caught up in adult personal dramas. But why this book resonated so much with me, I don't think I particularly love beautiful writing. I don't really love poetic writing. I admire it, but I don't adore it. But this is beautifully written, and I absolutely adore it. I think it's because it's the language so well evokes a particular kind of era and a particular kind of childhood, and not a huge amount happens, and yet it's still really dramatic. Again, it really influenced my writing, because I think it's something about thinking about two different sides to a story. I always try and do that. I like to do that in my writing. With this, we can see things from the child's point of view, but we can see things that he can't see. And I really admire the way that's done. It's done beautifully, really subtly. He's such a good character. He's really, you can see all his social anxieties, and he's looked after a bit by the young lady of the house, the young woman of the house, who he becomes the go-between for, but she sort of recognises that he's uncomfortable in he's only got one suit and it's hot and he's uncomfortable, and she takes him shopping, which is a glorious day for him. And just all these little things happen, and he sort of gets drawn into this world that he doesn't quite understand. And it's just devastating. The whole thing is just devastating, and the sort of misunderstandings. And it's got, I think it was the first book I've read that had a framing device, which I really love. It starts and ends with the older man looking back on this seminal time of his childhood, and kind of it was the moment where everything changed for him. Everything went wrong, really, and he's trying to look back on it and work out what happened. And yeah, I find the ending absolutely devastating. And it's got a very famous first line, The Go-Between. Lots of people know the first line, even if they don't know where it's from. It's the past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. And that is a staggeringly good first line. But the thing that always gets me is a line in the last chapter, which is the second half of the framing device, when he's looking back and he goes back to the house where all these events happened. And there's a line in it, and I can't say what the line is, because for a start, it doesn't really mean anything out of context. It's only if you've read the whole thing, but it's also a bit of a spoiler. And I remember reading this, and my dad and I did used to really bond over literature. He really liked reading. He probably gave me The Go-Between to read, and was absolutely destroyed when I finished it. I was in tears, and I said, and that bit at the end, and he said the line that I was thinking of, and I thought how, I think often about that and how powerful books can be about, connecting people. So yeah, that's a weepy, and I recommend it a lot. That is one I recommend a lot. I've told several of my writing students to read it, and they have really loved it. But I do not recommend the film. Don't come at me, people. I don't like the film. I think film is not nuanced. The film is much more famous than the book because it's got Alan Bates and Julie Christie in it, but it is a pale imitation, in my opinion. But if you like the film, you'd really like the book.
If I don't like watching a film when I've read a good book. It spoils it for me. Well, everyone's got to read that book now because we all got to know what the last line is. So.
Well, it's not quite the last line. It's in the last chapter. Yeah, don't just turn to the last line because it won't be that and it won't mean anything.
There's another one I got to read now. I don't think I've seen the film, but I used to watch everything Alan Bates was in because I really liked him. I don't know why. Looking back now, he wasn't that nice looking, but I think it's because I fell in love with him because of the books I enjoyed. I loved Rainbow and Sons and Lovers, and he was in Sons and Lovers, wasn't he?
And Women in Love, I think, yeah.
Women in Love, that's the one. And he was also in a Thomas Hardy one, Far from the Madding Crowd. And because those were my two favourite books as a teen, and he was in them, I fell for the characters he played, I think, because wasn't that nice looking.
I don't really remember. Well, he's supposed to be the heartthrob in The Go-Between as well, but I can't particularly see it. And yeah.
And so then you think you were around 16 then, weren't you?
Yes. I don't think very much was going on for me. I was just about to leave my girls' school, and that was a very good moment for me. I went to a girls' school, and this is my ugly duckling phase, I guess. This makes it sound like I turned into a beautiful swan. We're just going to have to moderate those expectations somewhat. But I was your classic sort of geeky, glasses, spots, big hair. And then I left school at 16 and went to technical college, very near Romford, in fact. I went to Redbridge Tech and to do my A-levels, and everything sort of changed all at once. It was like, imagine a kind of makeover montage. I started growing my hair, which was a big improvement because I had quite big round hair up to then, and then it went downwards. And I got contact lenses, and I didn't have to wear my horrible school uniform anymore. And I went to a college that had boys in it, and so I guess my life started opening up, and I made new friends, and doing A-levels, doing subjects that you were interested in. Everything just sort of opened up a bit.
Weren't perms popular around that time though?
I had naturally curly hair, but
so you were fashionable. So why you shouldn't? I mean, now everyone's trying to straighten their hair, or they were about a couple of decades ago. But with your beautiful curly hair, you didn't even need a perm.
Well, I don't think beautiful was the word that anyone would have given it had they seen it when I was 16. No, it was. I almost considered getting a perm to try and solve its many problems, but I think that might have created more. No, definitely not. No one admired it then, but once it grew a bit, then I felt a bit more confident about it.
Well, you're beautiful now, so I don't believe that you're ever an ugly duckling.
Well, you're very sweet. I have many, many filters on my Zoom camera.
So shall we go on to your third book?
Yes, so this is getting a bit more grown up now. You won't think that if I tell you it's a Judy Blume book, but it's Wifey, which is most definitely not for children. I think it might have been the first adult book she wrote, possibly. If you're my age, you sort of probably went through a Judy Blume phase, and we all finished by reading Forever, which was the slightly rude one. Which got passed around like contraband in my college. But then in my early 20s, I read Wifey, which is just an absolute romp with tons and tons of really rude sex scenes in. I don't know if anyone ever did accidentally think, oh, Judy Blume, I'll give that to my child. I really hope not. But it really influenced me in many ways. Again, with my writing, I just loved, the sort of the sex scenes in it I really loved, and partly because of that book, and partly because part of my career was working in sexual health, I've sort of developed a bit of a sideline in helping writers with their sex scenes. In fact, I run a workshop regularly. I'm running it next month, I think, at the Hastings Literary Festival, called Writing Sizzling Sex Scenes. And they're really brilliant in that. I love the way that she writes about sex in that, but I just love the whole story. It's classic kind of 1970s marriage where the woman is sort of dimly aware that there's this thing called feminism, but hasn't really, kind of signed up to it yet. Her husband's quite old school. And it's just a really interesting exploration of the marriage. There's some lovely details in it. One thing that I particularly love is that she bears a resemblance to Jackie Kennedy, or Jackie Onassis as she was by this point. And her mother-in-law keeps entering her for like Jackie Kennedy looky-likey competitions and things. They're sort of, I think I read that not really when I was in my 20s. I maybe didn't really know who Jackie Kennedy was, or didn't understand her sort of mystique. And that was very appealing. And it's just a very well put together book with very believable characters and scenes. And the central marriage, although not great, is very believable. And she has an affair. I mean, I don't think that's a spoiler. She has an affair, and I just think it's one of those great books where at the time that she's making decisions, you're totally on board. You're like, yay, go Sandy. And then they all fall apart and you're like, no, why did you do that? And then she does something else and you're like, yay. You just sort of get pulled around by what the heroine does. And I just love that. You're kind of rooting for her all the way. So, yeah, that's my endorsement of Wifey.
That's a good question, because I read the blurb to prepare for this. And it said something about, husbands suggesting she does X, Y, or Z to fill her time. But the thing that she found most fascinating was the naked man on this motorbike. And I thought, come on, you're going to have to tell me who this naked man on motorbike was.
Well, who he is remains a secret till really near the end. And in fact, it's never completely 100% resolved, which I rather admired. Sort of her slight awakening is kind of triggered really by looking out of her window one morning and seeing this naked man on a motorbike outside her window, and he's clearly there for her. He's not doing anything, he's just naked on the motorbike, and he's wearing a Stars and Stripes crash helmet, which has kind of become significant. And I think it's just a kind of a signifier of things are changing and the sexual revolution, and just the whole thing is such a romp. It's such a fun romp. So yes, I love that. But yeah, the blurb doesn't really help actually. The blurb makes that seem a much bigger part of it than it is. But if it's going to entice you in, then yeah, bring it on.
It's a good old hook, isn't it?
Yeah.
So you would be older then, reading these very adult books.
We should hope so.
Yeah, I hope so.
I guess I would be in my 20s. I did a degree, and then I went and lived in North Wales for several years. And my first part of my career was as an academic. I taught psychology in a university, and I studied for a PhD. And I thought I was going to have an academic career. It turned out that I didn't have an academic career, but that's what I thought at the time. But those were really nice years. I had a really good time in North Wales. I realised that I really liked teaching. I focused much more on teaching than research, and I did really love teaching. And that sort of teaching has been a part of my life ever since in various different ways. But I did also discover that I like writing. Then I used to write. I started off writing handouts for the students on the various different psychology things I was teaching them, and then I got given the job, which was very enjoyable, of writing a little guide for students who might be thinking of coming to the psychology department in the university. And lots of people praised it as being sort of funny and a bit irreverent. And yes, this is what I want to do. I want to write little guides. That was my plan then.
Oh, because I'm going off a tiny little bit off, because I wanted to talk about this. Your non-fiction books, you wrote 2 non-fiction books, and I have to mention one of them is called For the Love of the Archers, because I'm a huge Archers fan. And I'm just fascinated. What led you to write these books, For the Love of Shakespeare and For the Love of Archers? And let's have a quick talk on Archers, because that's one of my favourite topics.
Well, me too. Yes, I know they're slightly odd juxtaposition, Shakespeare and the Archers. They're both great British institutions, of course. But how I was commissioned to do them. The Archers one is quite funny. how it came about. I was talking to, I'd recently had my first novel published, and I'd sort of joined a group of writers who were called the Prime Writers, because we were all people who'd had their first novel published after the age of 40. And we had an actual in-person gathering, and I got talking to one of them called Carrie, and she said she kept getting stalled from her novel because she was doing a lot of non-fiction writing for a non-fiction publisher. And she said, oh, they keep asking me to do these books. I'm doing all these sorts of things. You know, I've written a book about wine and one about soup. And then she said, but now they've asked me to do one about something I know nothing about. And I said, oh, what is it? And she said, The Archers. And I said, gasp, I know about The Archers. Because I'd listened for years. My mum used to listen, and I'd kind of sort of fallen into it, originally ironically, and then kind of got committed. And so she said, oh, do you want me to give them your name? And I said, oh, yes, go on then. And so eventually there was a bit of shenanigans, because at the time I was writing an Archer's blog, and it was a bit, rude, really, and a bit, I didn't really bother to do much research. I just sort of made things up as I went along. So the very first question that the publisher asked me was, do you know how to do research? And so I convinced them I could. Well, I told them that, but they didn't seem that impressed. And it was really fun. It was really fun to write it. And they asked me a year after I had to update it. And I did one or two further updatings. And then there was nothing for a while. And then this year they've asked me to update it again. But 5 years have passed. Well, you know, Deborah, how much has happened in the past 5 years. barely a storyline left unturned. So I'm slowly working my way through it. And every page has got like so many changes on it. So much has happened. So don't buy it now, fans. There will be a new edition out, probably for Christmas, maybe. I don't know. And I've got to finish that by the end of October.
So much is already happening. What with Alice, who's an alcoholic and she's gone off to rehab, you won't be able to write fast enough to keep up with all the melodrama going on.
I know. I think with Alice, I'm going to have to wait till the last minute before submitting the manuscript, before I write up what's happened. And then it's all happening in Home Farm this week, and the Casey wedding. I mean, I'm sure your listeners are dropping away in droves now, Deborah. They're all like falling on the ground if they don't listen to The Archers, going, what is going on?
But I'll just say, before we move on, because we have viewers all over the world, and I don't think everyone knows what The Archers is. It started out about after the war, didn't it? To teach people about agriculture and the land. And it was a drama of everyday farming folk is the tagline. And it has been an institution. So like you, my mum would be listening to it. The tune has been pretty much the same. And it's gone all through. I know the Archer families right from when I was a little girl, and the adults were children. They've all grown up with us. But it's become much more dramatised and melodramatic in recent years as writers have changed, and it's got more up with the times.
Yes, so there are still really long slack periods where nothing much happens apart from a delivery of slurry.
Oh, well, let's go on before I end up having to edit this, because we've gone on for far too long about the Archers, which I could do.
Before we move on, Deborah, just tell me your least favourite Archers character.
Oh, Brian Aldridge.
I love Brian.
Oh no, he's horrible. I did start watching it properly. I became an avid Archers listener after the affair with Siobhan, so that hooked me in. So he played his part.
Yes, he's always been a bit of a bad one, but I do like him.
So who do you not like?
Oh well, there are a few. I have long despised Kate, but I'm kind of coming around. Yeah, I know. I'm coming around to her. I don't really dislike any of them anymore. I just think they're kind of like my family. You just kind of tolerate them.
I think we're meant to not like Brian. So. Okay, so let's go on to your fourth book.
Oh yes, so that is can't read my own writing. It is Heartburn by Nora Ephron. So by this point, I was probably in my 30s. I'd met the man who was to become my husband, John, and he he and I had quite different cultural references. Well, some overlap, but he knew things that I didn't. And I can't remember if he'd already seen the film When Harry Met Sally, or if we were both watching it together for the first time, but we totally loved it. It's very, it still stands up really well. And I said how amazing I thought the scriptwriter was, Nora Ephron. And he said, oh, well, of course you'll have read her novel. And I said, no. And so he bought me a copy of Heartburn. And it became, I suppose, my favourite book. It's probably, if I had, if I had to choose one book, it would probably be that. It's a very short book. It's a novella, really. And it's a thinly disguised account of Nora Ephron's husband's affair. Her husband at the time was Carl Bernstein, who was one of the Watergate reporters. And Nora and he were like a sort of glamorous couple. But he was having an affair with Margaret Jay, who at the time was married to Peter Jay, who was a cultural diplomat, I guess, or I don't know what he was. He was in Washington anyway. And Margaret Jay is the daughter of James Callaghan, who was one of the UK prime ministers. Anyway, so Carl Bernstein was having an affair with Margaret Jay. This is all relevant because Nora Ephron wrote about it in her book Heartburn, and the copy I've got has my favourite all-time cover quote. I'm not sure who from, but it just says, "Proof that writing well is the best revenge," which is my motto. And it's a perfect little book. It's absolutely perfect. It crams so much into its small space. You can't see the moving parts, and it moves slowly towards an end, which is the dream that you wanted an ending, which it was first spelled out for me by David Chase, who's the writer of The Sopranos, when he was talking about his writing process. And he said, you want endings to be inevitable yet surprising, so that you're not inevitable because afterwards you could say, oh, of course that was going to happen, but surprising because you don't see it coming. And I think Heartburn really achieves that. It moves you so subtly towards what's going to happen that it's so satisfying. The ending is so satisfying. All the pieces were there and you didn't realise until they all slot into place. And also it's got recipes in it. It's like really eccentric little book. It's got little recipes, and some are proper recipes and some are just, when you're feeling really blue, there's nothing better than mashed potato. She tells you how to eat it. You mash the potato with tons of cream and butter, and then with each forkful you add another bit of butter. And it just makes you feel better. It's a perfect book. And it's interesting because whenever I have until recently taught for several years at a creative writing program in Brighton, and I normally start each new year by asking the students to say their favourite book. And sometimes I haven't read the books they've mentioned. I add them to my list. Sometimes I have read them, and sometimes I give a squeal of recognition because I like them. But I remember one year, one of my students, Amy, said her favourite book was Heartburn, and we both kind of just went, ah! And in fact, Amy has recently published her own books. I'm very proud. And not that I did anything, she did it by herself, but anyway. So I don't know what the moral of the story is. Read Heartburn, I guess. But yeah, that is it's a perfect little book. And if I go anywhere that's slightly stressful, I take it with me as a kind of talisman. If I took it when I went into hospital to give birth to my first child, I took it. I don't know why I thought I'd be reading. But anyway, I took it. I think I did do a bit of reading, actually. It's just there's something about it that I think it's the book I keep trying to write. There's something about its tone, its humour, its humanity that I keep trying and failing, but trying again to recreate in my own writing. And warning, the film also, like The Go-Between, don't bother with it.
You've given so many good books which are really helpful to writers that I'm going to go back and study them. Really helpful.
Oh, thank you.
Just diverse a little bit. In Brighton, there's lots of well-known authors, aren't there? I mean, it's a bit like London, really, London on Sea, because it is a real cultural centre as well. And I heard, I think it think it was listening to somebody being interviewed on Kim Nash's Kim the Bookworm, give a little plug for her Tuesday night, that one of the authors there from Brighton said that there was a bookshop that the different authors were taking a part in. Do you know anything about that? Are you involved?
Yes, I know a little bit about it. I think it's called the Bookmakers. It's only recently opened, and I think it has a desk in it for writers can come and just use the desk, and it's a showcase for local writers. I know that my friend Laura Wilkinson, who's a Brighton writer, I just saw on Instagram recently that she had got her books in there. I must go down and see if they'll take mine. Although I'm sort of outside Brighton, I don't know if I quite can. But yeah, it sounds like a really great new initiative, and I think they're hoping to run some little events from there. And I don't know what all else. I think William Shaw is very involved in setting it up. And an organisation that I do a lot of work with in Brighton. I'm running some sessions for them coming up soon. Is New Writing South, who are a writer support agency, and I know they're involved in it as well. So yes, I think that's pretty much all I know about it. But,
great initiative. Okay,
yeah.
So shall we go on to your fifth book?
Yes. So this is the first non-fiction in the list. And it's called This is the Story of a Happy Marriage, and it's by Anne Patchett. I read this I first read this maybe 10 or so years ago. I'd already, maybe even more recently than that, it's certainly published or was about to be published. And my friend, who's not a reader, said that she thought I'd really like it. And how right she was. It's a book of essays. Anne Patchett is known as a fiction writer, but I know this is sacrilege to say, but I don't really like her fiction at all. I know Liz in my writing group is really cross with me when I say this because she adores Anne Patchett's fiction. I've tried several of them. I just don't connect to it. There's something about it, but I really, really connect to her non-fiction. And this book has got maybe 10 or 12 essays in it. And they're not all about writing. Some are about her life and different aspects of her life. But there's 2 essays in it that are specifically about writing that really influenced me. One in particular is called The Getaway Car. And I give that to all my new students and, in fact, people I coach, because everybody gets something different out of it about their writing. And, in fact, I reread it twice a year, usually for classes, and I get something different out of it every time. It's about how she got started in writing and the way that she writes and how difficult some aspects of writing are. And she's got one particular story in it which resonates with so many writers that I know, which is she talks about when she's first thinking of an idea for a story. And she says that the idea in her head is so beautiful. It's like a butterfly whose wings are created from like some beautiful stained glass window, and it's flapping around in her head. And she lets it flap around in her head for a while. It just gets more and more beautiful. And then eventually, when she can't bear it any longer, she plucks that beautiful butterfly out of her head and she stabs it onto the table with a pin, and she pins it down onto the paper, and it becomes a dull and lifeless thing. And she said that's the closest that she can come to describing the horror and the sacrifices you make of getting the beautiful story that's in your head out onto the paper, and then how you then try and get it to be a bit more like the butterfly that you originally had in mind, and how forgiving of yourself you have to be that you can't really ever get something on the flat page that's as beautiful as the image in your head. And she says when she tells that story, people think she's being charmingly self-deprecating, but it's the best description of writing that she knows, and I totally agree with her. You have this idea and it just flits in and out of your consciousness, and it's like, it's going to be the greatest novel ever written, but then you start writing and you're slightly horrified by how, dull and tarnished it seems compared to the beautiful thing in your imagining.
I think I'm going through exactly that right now. I'm writing my sort of 4th, 5th novel, but the one I'm writing now, it's been in my head for so long that I can see the whole thing like a movie, and it's the first time I've sat down to write something where I know the whole thing and I'm really excited about it. And I had so many false starts because it just feels like, no, it's not good enough. No, it's not right. So I do know that all the other stories I've written, I've had a rough idea, but they've grown, I've gone with it. But when you come to it with this fully formed, beautiful baby butterfly that you want to, it's always going to be a disappointment at first.
I really feel for you. But I think, she does have some optimistic hope for the writer. I mean, one is that, only practice and keep writing can help shorten that journey from head to hand. And obviously you're really experienced, and it hopefully won't take long before you can, get the right start and get it into shape. But also just that, it's never going to be quite as we imagined it, but sometimes it's almost better in some ways. It's more real. It might be less like a stained glass window, but it's more like, real, messy, believable life. So I'm sure yours will be beautiful in the end.
And the other thing is of course, you can't get it perfect first time. The draft is just yourself telling yourself the story, isn't it? As they always say, it's just get it down and then go back. And it's the magic happens as you're writing.
Oh, totally. I mean, if you think about every bit of writing that you ever see, like, hoardings on the side of the road, or things on buses, or the side of the cereal packet, none of those, for none of them that was the first draft. Writing is rewriting, and I think sometimes new writers don't quite realize just how much there is. And I really hate the first draft. I'm desperate to get something that I can do things with. I can't stand, I just feel like it's like pouring sand into a sandpit, and only when I've got all the sand there can I start to shape it into castles. But I can't stand the blank page, really.
It's a really good way to describe it. So let's go on to what was happening in your life at that time. What happened? You've been through, you got your PhD in psychology. Did you use that at all apart from teaching? You went quite quickly into writing.
No, there was a long gap now. I'm well known amongst my friends for having had lots and lots of jobs, and so I finished the PhD, and then I just plunged into 10 or 12 years or so of just different careers. Some in health. I worked for an HIV organisation for a while, and I ran a young people's advice and counselling service, and I worked for a students' union, and then I went freelance and did hundreds of little jobs for people. And worked in sexual health. I taught sexual health in schools for a bit. And I'd started writing by this point. And then I started working for New Writing South, which is an agency I mentioned earlier in Brighton. And I was responsible for their education programme, which involved placing writers in schools to work with young people. And I was just so envious of the writers that I was placing. I kept thinking, I wish I could do that. I wish I was a writer and I could work with young people in schools and do all sorts of things. And so that helped me knuckle down to my writing. And I started writing what ended up being my first novel, but that took years and years to finish. I finished the first draft when I was on an Arvon retreat, and I was 8 months pregnant with my second child. And I knew I had to finish this first draft, otherwise it was never going to happen. And that was in 2005, and it didn't get published till 2014. So you can see that between finishing that first draft and it getting into any kind of recognisable state really took a long time. But yeah, I look back on that and I marvel sometimes that I just kept going. There were loads of rejections, obviously. But I think I'd sunk so much time into it, I just couldn't bear to abandon it. So I just kept going and going. And it finally happened.
Fantastic. Well done. Well, that takes us. I've always found my guests so fascinating, and I always end up going way over the time I should. So I have to be strict and cut myself off at certain points because I could keep on talking. But so tell me now.
Well, sorry.
Go on.
No, I was going to say that's very kind of you. I'm the one who's been doing all the waffling.
So the last question is to ask you, what would you take as your luxury on the desert island?
Well, you've given me pens and paper, haven't you?
And all the books, lots of books. So it's other than books and writing. What else?
Well, there's only one answer in that case, which is a endless supply of tea.
Any particular sort of tea?
Yes, thank you for asking. Yes, I prefer Numi organic morning breakfast tea, which I can only get now shipped over from America in bulk because they don't sell it in Britain anymore. Oh no, I think I get it from Holland actually. And I just close my eyes and press pay because it's like my one luxury, and it costs a fortune to get it sent here. But it's called Morning Rise. That's it, Morning Rise. Although it doesn't particularly wake me up in the morning, but if I had a whole load of that and some skim milk and a nice kettle, I would be fine.
Sounds good.
To go.
Fancy having such a specialist tea. I've not heard. I drink decaffeinated Earl Grey, so but at least that's widely available.
Yes, although we would not be fighting over the same tea because I don't really like Earl Grey or decaf. So you can keep yours on this island, and I'll have mine separately in a separate tin.
Okay, it's great. Well, it's been lovely chatting with you, and all of the books that you've discussed, and I'll put a link up to your website. Well, they'll have your Goodreads link, but I'll add something for your creative writing in case anybody's been tempted having listened to you, and I'm sure they will have. So thank you for coming to my island there.
What a beautiful island it is too, Deborah. Thank you very much for having me here.
Thanks. Bye-bye. I hope you enjoyed listening to this week's episode of Castaway Books. References for all of the books discussed in this show can be found on my website, which is www.abrakdeborah.wordpress.com. It's the letter K and then my name, Deborah, Deborah. So until next week, goodbye.